the president of the Berkeley Historical Society, and Harlem. I welcome you and thank you for coming today. This is quite an impressive history that you're going to be hearing about, and it was quite a project for Linda Rosen to have pulled together.
You need to speak louder.
Louder than that.
Or
Okay.
can you come forward a little?
Thank you for coming. Berkeley Historical Society has been in existence since 1978 and been in this building since sometime in the 90s, I think. And we would like you to consider becoming a member, if you're not already one, to support what we do. I hope you have had a chance or will have a chance to see our People's Park exhibit in our gallery, museum space right over there. We will have to close today. We can't open it after the program, but come back another time. It will continue until late September or October. So that's my remarks, and I'm happy to introduce Linda Rosen.
Welcome and thank you all for coming to Berkeley Experimental Schools Program, Yeasty Times. I'm Linda Rosen, and I got the idea to have a panel discussion when I listened to Joanne's talk on this Berkeley Experimental Schools. It was at the Bancroft Round Table. And afterwards we all huddled, or some of us huddled, and we heard and a few other people who came up with this idea of how to get we could expand upon their talk and have a panel discussion and some interaction and bring in all of you at the end. So the Experimental Schools Program had a big impact on the school district and the grant and the dependency on the grants, and then when the grants were taken away, it became a real problem for everyone. But there were a lot of wonderful, this was a very exciting movement that grew out of the times, and you're about to hear about it. And this is Joanne Tim, who is doing her PhD thesis on the Berkeley Experimental Schools.
Thanks, Linda. Can everyone hear me okay?
A little bit, yeah.
A little bit? Okay. How about now?
Yes.
Okay, I'll just talk at the top of my lungs. So, as Linda shared, I've been doing research on the Berkeley Experimental Schools, so I've come to this obviously not having been a participant, but having done some historical work on the experimental schools. And we want to start the panel today just by setting the stage for what you're going to hear about from our panelists today. So in Berkeley in the late 1960s, several significant alternatives to the existing school system emerged, influenced by the social movements of the time, like that of the free/experimental or alternative schools movement, and also the Third World Liberation movements. Both movements critique not just the existing structure of schooling, but also of American society itself. So students, parents, and teachers were advocating for a different kind of education, one that centered students' agency and freedom in the educational process, and one that also empowered minoritized communities and challenged systemic oppression. In particular, advocates of experimental schools wanted to address the alienation that students felt from school and advocated freedom from discipline, the authoritarianism of the classroom, and the pressures of conformity, grades, and competition. They wanted to create schools that centered students' autonomy and that utilized experiential pedagogies within open, collaborative learning environments. At the same time, Berkeley also stood at the heart of the growing Black Power movement as it neighbored the headquarters of the Black Panther Party in Oakland and was the site of Stokely Carmichael's pivotal Black Power speech in October 1966. UC Berkeley was also the home to the Third World Liberation Front, in which students demanded the creation of a Third World College dedicated to the histories of African Americans, Asian Americans, Chicanos, and Native Americans, and which eventually led to the establishment of ethnic studies today. So it's this confluence of social, cultural, and political factors that influenced the creation of the Berkeley Experimental Schools. Just to backtrack a little bit, I also want to note that these movements came right on the heels of Berkeley's struggle for school desegregation. So Berkeley was the first school district of its size to voluntarily desegregate with two-way busing, and prior to that, Berkeley had been a politically conservative city. Both the City Council and the Board of Education were dominated by Republicans, and it wasn't until the early 1960s that the political and social character of Berkeley shifted, mostly due to the growth of the University of California, and also to the emergence of a sizable and politically active Black community. So Berkeley experienced a demographic shift in the post-World War II era as substantial numbers of Black workers migrated from the South to the Bay Area, drawn by the shipbuilding industry. It was this boom that enabled the creation of a democratic coalition of liberal whites and politically active Black community that supplanted Berkeley's old conservative leadership. And this is also what created the space for Black organizers to demand the desegregation of Berkeley schools. In the 1960s, UC Berkeley gained a reputation for being a prototype for student protest, and this also brought in a new breed of politically active young people who also saw the city as an alternative to suburban stagnation and urban helplessness. So the struggle for school desegregation culminated on September 10, 1968, the day that Berkeley rolled out its total desegregation plan, which included desegregating all 14 of Berkeley's elementary schools, in addition to 3 junior high schools and through two-way busing. However, 1968 was also the year of many significant changes. On September 8, 1968, just 2 days before the first day of school, mass protests flooded the streets of Telegraph Avenue in response to the news that Black Panther leader Huey Newton was convicted of manslaughter for killing an Oakland police officer, a conviction that was later dismissed. Desegregation also faced fierce opposition from many white families in the Berkeley Hills who moved to the suburbs in response to the district's plans, as well as some Black families as well, for different reasons. As David Kurt notes in his book, Just Schools, shortly after 1968, the aspiration to genuinely integrate Berkeley schools ceased to enjoy the pride of place on the agenda of the school system, due in part to a changing ideological climate which affected not only Berkeley, but the nation as well. It is within this setting that teachers, students, and parents began forming small alternative schools in order to address 2 issues that have become central within the school district. The first stemmed from fears about racial conflict at the high school, and the second concerned students' feelings of alienation. Influenced by the movements of the time, students, parents, and teachers aimed to address these concerns by creating their own experimental schools. These schools were later institutionalized in the form of the Berkeley Experimental Schools Project after Berkeley Unified School District won a 5-year, $6 million federal grant. But this was also done often without the consent of many of these grassroots constituents. Thus, there remained a clear distinction and tension between the ideals and visions of the teachers who created the experimental schools and that of the district who created an apparatus of administrators, supervisors, and evaluators who were not there before. The schools within what became part of the Berkeley Experimental Schools also varied, with some focusing on the ideals of progressive education, open classrooms, and democratic schooling, and others on the development of students' positive racial identities and political empowerment. You can find a list of these schools on the back of your program. So, in today's panel, teachers from Other Ways, Community High, and Casa de la Raza will reflect on their experiences being part of these experimental schools. Panelists will discuss their vision in creating and teaching in each school, how they sought to actualize it in practice, and challenges they faced, given the challenges they faced in doing so, as well as how the social context of the time influenced their work and lessons for today. Also, just as a caveat, because we weren't able to find or include representatives from each of the 23 schools today, we want to be clear that today's discussion is simply a partial reflection of a few experiences of particular participants in specific schools, and certainly does not represent the experiences of everyone involved in the schools. Also, unfortunately, Robert McKnight was not able to come today because he had to be at a funeral, and so instead of having a representative from Black House, I'll be speaking a little bit about the archival work I've done on Black House, but we're sad to report that unfortunately were not able to find a representative from Black House today. But we'll start with Herb Cole talking about his experiences with Other Ways.
It's just, I arrived in Berkeley in Christmas 1967. I did not come to Berkeley to set up a school. I was a visiting professor at Cal, and I was coming basically for rest and recreation. And my wife and our oldest child, who was a couple of months old then, and myself came here. And at the end of my tenure at Cal, I was just a visiting professor. I got a grant from the Carnegie Corporation of New York for myself and Alan Capro, who, if any of you know, is the central figure involved in happenings. So they basically married us. But they not only married us, but they married us on the cutting edge of the art world, and I had just come from some community control of school struggles in New York. So we were just told, here's this money, and do teacher education and develop curriculum. So I went to Cal, and you might say I had a bit of a difficult reputation according to the university, so they wouldn't take the grant. So I just looked around and I made an appointment. I sat down with Neil Sullivan, who was the superintendent in Berkeley at the time, and I asked him if he'd accept the grant. He didn't ask me anything. He said, sure. So I wasn't fighting that one. And he said, you can have an office, which is now Nakamura Realty on King, which those days was Grove Street. And you can do anything you want. That office is empty. We have a lease on it. It's where we plan the desegregation. Characteristically, with most large-scale desegregation, it was hypocritical. That's another thing I can certainly talk to, but not now. But it was at what's now Nakamura Realty. And we were given that space because that's where they planned the desegregation, and it was no longer needed. So I set up a teacher education seminar, drawing on teachers from Berkeley High, Willard Junior High, King, it wasn't King then, it was Garfield, I believe, and in fact, just to get a sense of the atmosphere, King had just been assassinated. And I was coming from New York where we experienced Kennedy, Malcolm X, the assassination. The times were very tense if you wanted to make a change. And so, anyway, at our storefront, a bunch of students, a couple of teachers from Willard asked if I would teach a writing class. And they brought in a whole bunch of junior high students, 9th graders. And they came and became students and didn't want to go back to Willard or Berkeley High. They wanted to stay at our place. At the same time, there were a lot of young people from Berkeley High who were out of school by choice. That is, some who were still involved in the school, but were full-time involved in politics on the streets. And there were some other kids who were out in Provo Park and who were just out of school. And they started dropping in at our place. And they had nowhere to go. And I had some hunger for teaching again. And we had another group of people who I knew in Berkeley who were interested in teaching, and so we declared ourselves a school. And Capro and I came up with the name Other Ways, plural. The idea is that there's nothing wrong with us to create a school in parallel with whatever currently exists. Berkeley High at that time was having considerable problems with race, with some of the quality of what was going on there, and with the frustration of some of the most creative teachers there, who themselves were trapped into a system they did not create. And so we became other ways. And what I did was set up a evaluation. I did everything possible in order for the district to just say, yeah, we will change the way we operate, change the rules, and you're welcome. They did the opposite. Don't want you, you're not welcome. So we ended up having to be, well, just to tell you, I come from the Bronx, and when there's a fight, I'm there. So if it's for justice. And so we had a battle until I left the school in what I thought was good position. Is my time up? Oh, okay. So I went about teaching, one way to create schools in a district that does not welcome you is to cover what they claim to cover, but do it in your own way. So that I covered literature by bringing in all kinds of things that may not have been in the curriculum, but spoke to the hearts and souls and ambitions of the students. We began, by the way, because I had some friends at the Lawrence Hall of Science, we began to use the computers up there. And we were allowed computer time when people in the schools were fighting over whether computer-based education was good or not. We were doing it, except that we had these big printouts and these long, long programs to write, so that only some of our kids had the patience for it. And in a school like ours, or a place like ours, or a community like ours, two things happened. One, all the problems existed in Berkeley were at the school. We had racial problems, we had problems of performance, we had gender problems, or you name the problems that facing Berkeley High. The difference is we were committed to be explicit about the problems, engage the kids in the solutions of the problem, and actually teach to it and use a rich curriculum around which we could build a convivial school setting. It didn't work easily. It was a very difficult thing because we had to raise our own money. We had to do everything from scratch, and then the district would put restraints on us. But fortunately, a couple of teachers from Berkeley High let us use the costume room at the theater, so that's where I did my guerrilla theater. But the high school wouldn't have a guerrilla theater because we did it in the supermarkets, and this was an anti-war theater. The other ways was overtly political. We did not pretend to be neutral about race or gender or anything. So we were very definitely a politically oriented towards justice and equality and equity, and therefore we built our school around that at a time in which everybody tried to hide under the kind of mask of neutrality of learning in the school. Again, we had a group of teachers who came from other schools who themselves wanted to become involved in that. And my idea was to welcome as many well thought out, fully conceptualized, because you can't realize education till you try it, and then you know that all your plans have to be redone at least a dozen times before you get it right, if you ever do. And then I was very fortunate in that I was able to create a curriculum in which we, Valia Kitrilakis, who some people might have known, did a internship program for us. So we could place all our kids in what was the beginning of a tech industry in Berkeley, in Oakland, in Emeryville. We had the freedom to consider the entire Bay Area, but we mostly considered Berkeley as our classroom, as well as what we do in the classroom. And so we did things like, out of my guerrilla theater troupe, we were asked to participate in a movie called Billy Jack, which you may or may not have seen. I urge you to do it. It's a cult film about a free school in New Mexico. All the kids in that school were otherwise students, with the exception of the daughter of Tom Laughlin, who was the producer and star. Anyway, what we were is open to develop, had a core of ideas that had to do with literacy and empowerment that we tried to instantiate, to embedded how we taught and what we taught and how we related to the community. In my time there, the district once granted us $10,000 for whatever. They will be, in other words, what was beginning to happen is we were beginning to erode the district's resistance. I think a lot of this came from the parents of our students and from community people. And Berkeley at that time had switched from Republican to being quite a progressive, as when Ron Downs was on the city council and began to represent us. Quite a more open community. And I kept on reminding people that Berkeley was no different than any other place in America, except that it enjoyed having the spotlight shined on it, primarily, I would believe, because of the free speech movement, which was prior to all of these schools. In fact, Mario Savio's children did not go to one of these schools. Anyway, as the schools developed, we tried to create a group of the directors of the schools, and we met together. And then we were rudely interrupted by the federal government's Experimental Schools Program. I'll leave it there.
I'm Carl Brush. When this experimental school project began, or a year or two before, I was teaching English and a little bit of drama at the high school. And we were not originally part of any federal funding. When Jay Manley, Peter Kleinbard, got the whole idea of community high school going and kind of invited me along for the ride, our concept was to, in response to all the things that both Joanne and Herb have described, the rigidified and unresponsive school system, the racism and so on and so forth that was endemic, the tumultuous times. The free speech movement started in '65, if I remember right, and the demonstrations would continue for quite a while, and they would often start in Sproul Plaza, and their target was to come to City Hall. And of course, guess who was right in the way, on the way? Crowds would pour through Provo Park, and it was very exciting for some students who were politically motivated, and some students who were just happened to be in the park or doing the kind of thing that Herb was describing, or certainly not in a classroom. And we were some of the group of the faculty that were trying to figure out another way to respond to that. And our idea was not so much to be a peripatetic, community-wide kind of structure, but to work within what was already there and see if we could transform it. It was easy for us to come up with the title Community High School because we felt there was so little community going on. There were not just students who were dissatisfied, but whole families who were finding themselves unserved, underserved in a whole number of different ways. And we thought that if we could get a nucleus of programs together with people who could make communication with one another and with the community part of their everyday educational experience, then we could perhaps influence the whole structure of the school to become more responsive, to be not so stratified. I think that I taught in the English department. I think there were 5 different academic tracks at the time that I began there. I mean, that's how carefully we were able to tease out the different layers of ability and accomplishment that we were able to place these students in different places. And of course, the color hue of the various tracks is something that I don't even need to discuss. But at any rate, we came up with the notion that if we were able to start with one grade level and draw together a population of students and families that reflected the demographics of the whole rest of the student body, we could start proving that just because you have X number of black students, white students, and so on and so forth, and so many people who perform poorly or well on various standardized tests, if we could bring them together and form some sort of harmonious and academically viable group, that we could show people that you really didn't need to be that prescriptive about who people were and why they were there or why they should be there, really, because there was, obviously no logical reason for it except a logic that was so visited upon us from the outside that it made no sense whatsoever. So our first year we were able to draw that kind of a population together. It's very, very gratified and surprised to see a couple of members of that original class at community high school here. And we did get some extra money to hire an evaluator, so we hope that we would be able to have some sort of outside measure beyond our own promotion of ourselves to show that we were doing okay. And so we had a really pretty successful first year, despite an enormous amount of hostility from the rest of the faculty and community and administration. It was quite an experience. We were able to stake out a little separate territory for ourselves in the community theater building and a couple of other places that, so we could be ourselves and so on. Our concept was that that it could be very important to use the arts as kind of an overarching or a glue to put these people all together. You couldn't necessarily expect all the kids to know any level algebra all the time, but everybody can respond to a play, to music, and so on and so forth. And we thought that would be a good common experience, and it would be a way of, those are things that could be infused into all the liberal arts curriculum in one way or another, and that if we did that and also encourage students to talk to one another and to make a lot of educational and structural decisions together, not just having the teachers sit down and say, well, this is how it's going to be, and hey, students, guess what we thought of, but to have families actually try to decide some of these issues for themselves and evaluate them and then go on from there. We divided ourselves into, was it 5 different tribes? Anyway, maybe something like that. Anyway, we divided ourselves into smaller units. We wanted to be a smaller unit compared to the big high school, but we also wanted smaller units within so we could have discussions where everybody could have some airtime and some input, and that you could see the results happening right before your eyes and be able to say, hey, this worked, that didn't work, what are you talking about, and so on. So that was the structure we began with, and I think we wanted to, I wanted to also say that we wanted to work essentially within the same financing that everybody else got, so that we wouldn't be open to the charge that, hey, everybody could do that if they had that much money. And so we tried to stick pretty close to that. We didn't get a lot of outside money, and so once the experimental school, the federal money came in, it suddenly became a whole different ballgame. And I hate to say that money is a big problem, because lack of money is usually the big problem we're always talking about. But to my way of thinking, and I think ours, that sudden infusion of money into the district and into the program did become a problem because we lost our focus in a lot of ways. So I'll let Susan go on from there.
And I didn't want to repeat what Carl has so ably described here as being the history of the school. So I was trying to think about several ideas that I've brought from going back 50 years. You realize we're talking 50 years ago. Going back 50 years and trying to sort through what few things really stood out to me. And the first thing I would like to speak about is that I think it was the civil rights movement, more than anything else, which provided the engine enabling the alternative school movement in Berkeley. I don't know if I realized this at the time, but in retrospect, that seems very much to be the case. The school board in Berkeley had decided that they wanted to follow up on Brown versus the Board of Education and desegregate the schools. It was called integrate the schools then. And the high school, there was already one high school in the whole city of Berkeley. So they focused on the elementary school after the junior high schools. There were 3 junior high schools, and one was made into an all-city 9th grade. And then there were, so then the task became what to do about the elementary schools. And The Ramsey plan was the plan that was used, busing in order to deliver that response. Okay, and the superintendent at the time was Neil Sullivan, whose dream it was to bring this about and to make this a reality in the city of Berkeley, and I believe the first in the country. So that was the background, and then that was the dream, and operationally, the plan was as I've described it. The reality became very different from that, in that how was the city of Berkeley, the school board, supposed to deliver integration or equal educational opportunity and equal educational rights? Mechanically, that could be done, but in terms of in the classroom, how were the needs of all these different communities in Berkeley to be met? And so, just as it was beginning to be clear that this was a very, very complex thing to deliver, Neil Sullivan left Berkeley and went back east, and a new superintendent was brought in, Richard Foster, who had a history, mostly in the suburbs, of working with experimental schools. And we, at the time, thought that this was going to be a superintendent who was very supportive of of community high school, and it turned out to be much, much more difficult than what we had anticipated. So why this affects the alternative schools in a very different way is that because the school board was unable to make everybody happy with a desegregation plan, Richard Foster's idea was that we're going to have cultural pluralism. And the way to deliver cultural pluralism was through a proliferation of small schools that would cater to the interests of various groups within Berkeley. Okay, so in that regard, the school that we were involved in was given a heightened focus because of the interest in the civil rights interest in the city of Berkeley. So that's one thing that I understand historically. What? I'm just out of time?
Okay.
Oh, okay. The other concept that I got from looking back over all of this was Herb said to us in one of our planning meetings, you need to embed education in social struggle. The schools must be a piece of making a more just and equitable society. And as a history teacher, I very much subscribe to that point of view. And this was not something that could be achieved within Berkeley High School, and could much more effectively be achieved within community high school, because Berkeley High School had, I can't tell you how many tracks in the academic departments. All the academic departments were tracked. Berkeley Community High School was supposed to be a heterogeneous community. There were no tracks. It was supposed to be interdisciplinary. Berkeley High School, the departments were like hermetically sealed. You had absolutely no interaction at all. If you wanted to teach a course that was interdisciplinary, no chance of that. Just very, very quickly, another thing was that to take a class or to have students working outside of the school, for example, going up to Telegraph Avenue with tape recorders to interview people who were involved in the protests, or James Rector being killed 1 block away from East Campus, getting students involved in journalism that would not have been possible at Berkeley High School. So within community high school, this became an opportunity for those of us who felt very, very confined by the walls, by the departments, by the policies of the bigger school. Okay, maybe we can get back to that.
Linda Rosen, and I'm sharing the Casa de la Raza story with Francisco Hernandez, who is my compadre, as well as the director of the school in year 2 of Casa. First of all, I want to thank the Berkeley Historical Society for making this possible, and in particular because it really provided me with an opportunity to take a moment and look back 46, 48 years ago. And part of that delight was a couple of things. One, having some really thoughtful conversations, not only with Francisco, but with Orlando, who was an evaluator year 1, and he'll be speaking later, and Estela, who was one of the teachers later on with me, as well as this is so special for me, is that one of my students from those days, he was like 8 years old when we started, 7, 8 years old. He's here today. He came all the way up from Riverside. So I wanted to introduce Michael Villas. I kind of wanted to put this in perspective too, historically, because the 60s was a turbulent time. It was an exciting time, as probably many of you remember. But Chicanos, Mexicanos, we sort of get we get drifted a little bit in terms of how folks treat us historically. We get the short end of the stick always. And I sort of wanted just to remind us that the Chicano movement really began in 1848 with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo and the artificial creation of the border, which still resonates today, right? And the conflicts that we have, because it is artificial. And at that time was born the first Chicano, right? Because Chicanos are Mexicans, but born in the United States. So here we are. And so our movement started way back when. And of course there were struggles and there was fights and there were Chicanos standing up for the rights and that we be treated equally, etc. And I'll just bring it up quickly to 1946 with the landmark case decision that some of you are familiar with because you have a school in Berkeley now named for Sylvia Mendez. And her case was the groundwork for the beginning of the end of school segregation, first in California and then nationally. We also had the GI Forum, which was the movement for civil rights and for the vets, the Chicano vets. And then in the 60s, we had MAPA and we had LULAC, which were political organizations trying to have fight for more representation of our people at state level, etc. And then it continued throughout the Southwest. In New Mexico, there was Reyes Lopez Tijerina and the movement for the land grants. In the 60s and 70s, Corky Gonzalez was in Denver, Colorado with the Crusade for Justice, and he organized the first Chicano student conference in the late 60s. And the student movement was really very, very strong. Some of you probably remember there were walkouts in LA. Those were some of the first student walkouts, and there were walkouts throughout the Southwest. There was a La Raza Unida party, which I voted for at one point for a governor from California. I can't remember who, but the fact is we were pushing, right, continually to push to be more involved. And then in the late 60s, as Joanne mentioned, there was the TWLF student strike at Cal, and both Francisco and I and Estela participated in that strike. And there it was students of color fighting to have a third world college, which never came to fruition. And what we have today is ethnic studies there, but it's struggling, and it's a fight that's still going on today. So I hope some of you will join us when that comes to vote with the chancellor. And then we come to Casa and Casa de la Raza and how that came about. And I was so lucky. One of the students who still lives here lent me her yearbook from that time. And so this is the treasure, because, you know, I could make up stuff up here, but this really says it. And she talks about the history, and she says in the spring of 1970, Sylvia Vasquez, I remember the Chicano walkout at Martin Luther King Jr. High. About 400 blacks, Chicanos, whites, and Asians walked out with us, along with some students from Berkeley High School and West Campus. The walkout took place because we wanted Chicano counselors. One thing led to another, and we decided to demand an all-Chicano school. The next step was to write out a proposal. Then we had to convince people that we needed a Chicano school. After a lot of talking, the school board passed it. That summer, we began planning for the new school that was to open in the fall. We had to hire teachers, find a school site, and also develop a curriculum, among other things. So, Casa was an experiment for sure. We were not prepared academically to start the school. I was not even finished with my teaching program, but I heard about they were going to start this Chicano school, and I said, I got to be there. I really do. I was working, the bilingual program in Berkeley had just started that summer to Bavet, and I was being trained as a teacher there, but I said, no, this is where I gotta go. So I just went. I had heard about it. I lived in West Berkeley, and I don't quite know how I heard about it, but I went knocking at the door and got a job as a teacher, elementary school teacher. And Victor Acosta, who was the director at the time, he had wanted to have as many faculty as possible, so many of us worked full-time for half pay. So I remember I got paid about $500 to work as an elementary school teacher at the time. And so the vision of the school and the reality ended up clashing somewhat, like a lot. It was seen as alternative education. The focus bilingual and culturally based, and definitely family oriented. It wasn't until I saw the yearbook that I realized we had a pre-K through 12th grade school. And the pre-K came mostly because some of our assistants that helped us in the classroom had their babies in hand, and so why not, right? We're a family. Chicanos are very used to all that, from baby to grown up. So we had the school that probably the district didn't know about, that we had the babies there, but we did anyway. And so that was so important. And Michael and all these kids today still talk about what was important at the school, and I'll reflect on that later on too. But basically, it was very political. I'm reminded all the time how we would take the kids on field trips that would never be allowed today. Be it everywhere from the farm workers to other kinds of political events. The kids remember it was very political. And even this yearbook is dedicated to the spirit of Raza, Emiliano Zapata. I would rather die on my feet than continue living on my knees. Probably some of you are familiar with that as well. And so this is something that was really, really important for us. But I have to be honest to say that pedagogically, we were not prepared. I was a brand new teacher, even and we did not have materials, we didn't have books. We didn't know a lot, most of us. Most of us probably were half the staff were not teachers even, and the other half barely had their credentials. So we had a major problem at the school, which was we were not academically prepared for our kids. And in the end, the school had a major fight the first year for two reasons. One is because on one hand, in the beginning, we were trying to be experimental, open classroom, that kind of thing. But in the end, I realized when one of the little kids climbed out the window when I was trying to teach that something was wrong here, that this is not education. And in particular in the Chicano community, of why they wanted their kids going to our school. So so one problem was the academics, because we had half the staff that, like I said, were not teachers, and they kind of wanted this experimental thing, but we didn't know what experimental was, and some of us had been very well trained in traditional education. And the Chicano community, they did want to see their kids learn how to read and write, and we were neglecting them on that point. So that was a real issue. The other major problem had to do with class issues. Half of the faculty were they were Latinos. And by that I mean people who were either born in Latin America or born here but raised with those values, and they were different than Chicano values. We were more working class. We were the first generation to be educated at the university. So there was real conflict between those two groups. So it blew up the first year, and the Mesa Directiva, which was the organization to run the school, had to kind of decide. These were the parents, the staff, and some students. And ultimately, there was a major shift to go to, hey, we want our kids educated. And we don't want the sort of experimental stuff that we don't know what that means if you're not educating our kids. And so second year, we ended up having a real move at focusing on curriculum. The only other thing I'll say at this time is that our facilities were bad. And I said, oh, really? I think I cross that out of my mind. They write here, we were located in the King bungalows, which were like being in the dumps. These were bungalows at the very back of the school. I don't know if any of you remember that. There was no heating and no water, and we used construction outhouses. The gym building had been condemned for over 10 years. The lighting was bad, and the classrooms were falling apart. It was very difficult holding classes, but we survived a year and a half under those conditions. So there was a lot of negative stuff that happened at Gaza. On the other hand, it was familia, it was the nurturing, the bonding that happened between the teachers and the kids that made all the difference in the world. It's not that formal education, but is the informal values that you need to have in your life. And that's what Michael reminds me of today, and that's what, when I see the kids today, that's what they talk about, that we were like family. I was like 8 years older than the high school kids. So I was their older sister. So we were really close, incredibly close, and that was the value truly of Gaza. Okay.
Thank you. My name is Francisco Hernandez, and I was the director in the second year of Casa de la Raza after all of the conflicts of the first year. I wanted to put Casa in additional historical perspective. I think the of the times perspective has been presented. But Casa was an effort. The vision was driven by the desire on the part of the Latino community to maintain their culture and their language. And that's a central theme, and it comes and it comes out in all the different ways that the school was organized. And that's actually part of the history of U.S. ethnic groups coming to this country, wanting to maintain their language and culture, and organizing churches and community groups, and then ultimately schools. The two biggest school systems developed by ethnic groups were by Germans and then also by the Polish immigrants. So even as late as 1948, there were about 600 Polish elementary parochial schools, enrolling about 180,000 students, and then about 68 parochial high schools, all in the taught through Polish, with about 12,000 students. And every ethnic group, as they arrived, created schools. I said the Germans were the most successful because they did both Catholic schools and Lutheran schools. The Polish did mostly the Catholic schools. And we have the remnants today of the Chinese day schools, Yiddish schools. All of those efforts continue, but they have been part of our fabric for a long time. And Latinos and Mexicans have been part of that too. So that the first U.S.-based Mexican school actually starts in 1851 in Los Angeles, immediately after the signing of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, and that continued. So that's one thread for the development and creation of Casa de la Raza. The second is the level of discrimination that the Mexican community of Berkeley felt at the time. Both discrimination regarding the structure of the school, but discrimination against individual students, which is also, as she mentioned, part of the reason for the walkout. So there was this general unhappiness. The next thread was the movement, as she described, the Chicano movement at the time, efforts by Chicanos to run their own institutions, create their own institutions. It was also a time of cultural and linguistic revivals, Santana, Chicano, the Royal Chicano Air Force, poetry, novels, festivals, all in an effort to maintain ethnicity and culture and language. So at the time of the creation of Casa de la Raza, there was the Casa del Barrio in San Jose, there was the Universidad de la Raza in Oakland, there was the Colegio del Rio Grande in Texas, and I think the list is, there's 16 total that I could identify at the time. So Casa was not an isolated case of a group of people wanting to maintain their language and their culture. Casa was also created, as has been described earlier, as a result of efforts by teachers and students and parents to want to have an alternative to what was going on. Indeed, Cohen, his dissertation about the experimental schools programs, noted that the original proposal of the ESP was for 23 schools, and Casa was added at the last minute because of protests from parents, right? And so we would think about Casa as it was part of the experimental schools program, but separate from it in the sense of that strong desire of parents to maintain the language and culture to the point where they would send their children to dilapidated. They saw what the school looked like. They knew that there were no bathrooms. They knew that there was no running water. And yet they were willing to send their children there because what they wanted was their children not to be discriminated against and wanted to maintain their language and their culture because they felt that the students were losing it by participating in the schools of Berkeley. At the time, I wrote this when asked about Casa. I said, Casa is an experimental school, and the hypothesis of any rational alternative to a linguistically, racially, and culturally biased educational system must be the following. Given the opportunity to confront the learning experience in a culturally relevant context and with a culturally relevant content, the excluded child will learn at the same rate as his and her annual counterpart. So that was our experiment. That's what we were trying to do at Casa. I think Timothy has already reflected that because the campus was only existed for 2 years and under attack for its whole existence, the measures of academic worth didn't come forward. What did come out, because I was fortunate in my dissertation to interview the families about why they sent their kids to Casa, why they went there. The overriding factor of all the things that were mentioned was, I want my children to be able to know their culture, their heritage, where they came from, their history, and I want them to be able to communicate in both the English and the Spanish language. That was their desire, that's why they sent their children there, and that's why the school was able to draw students, draw staff, draw faculty, and others. I do want to mention that Casa, like Black House, was one of the schools that was closed early. It was closed by the federal government, the Office of Civil Rights. They came to visit the school. They had been alerted to the existence of the school by 2 senators from states in the South. Wow. that said that if a school, a Black House, can exist in Berkeley, why cannot a Black House exist in Alabama and Georgia and Mississippi? And why can't we have a White House in Alabama and Georgia and Mississippi? The decision to close the school, the decision to attack the school, and the decision to close the school were both political. The district did not want to be part of a lawsuit, lose $5 million, but also didn't want to be part of a lawsuit that argued against the desegregation efforts of the South. They didn't want to be there. They consulted legal experts, David Kerp, one of them, there were others. And so the decision was made to negotiate. We negotiated, we tried to talk through many different alternatives. In the end, they said if Black students or if Mexican students are going to be in classrooms with just each other, that's a probable violation. There was never any finding of it, but as you know, they just said you can either close the schools or you can lose the $5 million. The Berkeley Unified School District decided to close the school instead. Now, the importance of Casa really comes now in today's context. 52% of all the students in all the grade levels in the entire state of California are Latinos. And just for your information, 52% of all the interim kindergartners in the Omaha schools in Nebraska are also Latinos. Same is true in the Carolinas and others. In Nebraska, it's meatpacking. Who wants to work in 0 temperatures and others. So my point is that what we experimented with at Casa brings a great deal of information to what the state needs to do today, because the same levels of discrimination, the same levels of the failure of the schools, it's seen by low graduation rates and seen by low participation in higher education. So that, unfortunately for us, the conditions that created Casa still exist today. So I think we have much to learn from Casa and what happened and what didn't happen. We'll take questions and hopefully some answers, and I thank you for coming and listening to us.
And some other schools were kind of part of our schools that we were covering. There were 7 of us working half-time, and each of us were supposed to cover 3 schools. Although we had a title of observer, evaluator, the matter is that our actual function turned out to be rather amorphous. were located on Oregon Street, and that level of evaluation, which was essentially some type of internal evaluation, existed there in a situation that was very familiar, very bureaucratic, and very much removed from sort of the day-to-day realities of what was going on in the schools and the struggles that some of these schools were experiencing. One of the first sort of experiences that I had to do with where I was in New York City. I'd come from New York City. I'd been involved in the anti-war movement, community organizing, and also in terms of a struggle to create a community-based district in the Lower East Side of New York City. So coming over to California, it was, and having dealt with bureaucracies and having dealt with systems as they existed, walking into the Oregon Street office seemed very, very familiar. It seemed very bureaucratic, very top-down. And as I became familiar with some of these schools, I also got the feedback from administrators and teachers that they were feeling that level of, they might describe it as oppression or top-down management. People who had been used to trying to, or functioning in a semi-autonomous framework were suddenly part of this whole process of the ESP, Experimental Schools Program. What evaluation was to provide was extremely unclear. We were to go into these schools, we were to go into the classrooms, we were to meet with teachers, administrators, parents, etc., and observe what was happening and then report back. But we had absolutely no format within which to do that. We spent weeks and then months in trainings, in workshops, meeting with consultants, meeting with other levels of evaluation, but absolutely not really engaging in anything that seemed very productive. When we got to the schools, we began to question, where is this money? We're not seeing it. We're not seeing it in these schools. I'm here at Casa. I'm here at Odyssey. I'm here at Community. I'm not seeing the resources being actually placed at the disposal of the students, of the community, of the teachers. I am seeing, and we all were seeing and commenting on the fact that we seem to have a lot of evaluators around, and we seem to have a lot of consultants around, and there was really some awfully nice state-of-the-art audiovisual equipment available. And the offices were nice, but we did not see that being translated into anything that we felt was reflected in the resources available to these schools. In particular, Casa de la Raza, which I think Valentina spoke about the physical plant, the portables, the lack of heat, actually, the lack of kind of minimal resources that you would expect in a physical plant of a normal school, a K through 12 school, a school that was rich with the involvement and the support of the community, of the parents, of the students. A school where people, yes, understood that the plant, the buildings were really dilapidated and slum-like, but they were willing to make that commitment to their children and to their children's future, that they be in an educational environment that was respectful, that was supportive, and that invited them, the community, to participate. So I saw a lot of community involvement. I saw parents building a playground, trying to build a playground on the grounds of the school, bringing food, doing whatever they could to be supportive and involved. Ultimately, after about a year of internal conflict, and there was a lot of internal conflict within the evaluation team precisely because of some of the issues that I've mentioned, that I left. So I was not around for the second school year for Casa, Black House, and the other schools. But from that perspective, it was down to the issues that we face today. I would say that nothing has really changed. You could essentially use the same language, the same rhetoric, and address the same concerns 50 years ago today using pretty much the same language, and we would be very contemporary because those issues are still present with us. They're unresolved, and they're ongoing in public education in the United States.
Unfortunately, we weren't able to find a panelist for today, so I'm going to share a little bit on my archival work on Black House, which also includes, I was able to interview a prior student who went to Black House, and so her narrative is included in here. And of course, if there are folks in the audience who were a part of Black House or participated in some way, I would love to speak to you afterwards to have a fuller picture of what the school was like. I'll say in summary, a lot of what was shared about Casa de la Raza sounds similar to some of the issues that Black House faced. So Black House, the origins of Black House really came out of both the free school movement and the Black Power movement. And Black House actually broke off of Community High. It was originally a part of Community High. Buddy Jackson, who was the founder of Black House, was actually a teacher there. And due to some of the racial tension at Community High, Black House later created their own school. And the goal of Black House was really, quote, created in specific response to the need of Blacks to come together on the basis of their Blackness, and its primary objective was to turn the tide on the effects racism had had on high school students. And so Black House really aimed to center Black empowerment. And it did so by creating a Black school within the community where most students lived, hiring a young and aware Black staff, and introducing an innovative and Black-oriented curriculum. Courses at Black House included offerings such as Black survival techniques, Black women, introduction to Black studies, Black art, slavery and reconstruction, Black literature, and Swahili. And this, quote, Black perspective was prevalent in all of the 30 courses offered at Black House. Pedagogically, Black House sought to impart knowledge that would provide an education designed to help students' survival as Black people and, quote, restore self-esteem in Black students, imbuing them with a sense of adequacy. Teachers believe that instilling in Black students a proud awareness of their own culture and an appreciation of the value of their Blackness would equip them to enter into a multi-ethnic and multicultural situations without being submerged, overwhelmed, and alienated, unquote. So it was in imbuing, imparting, and instilling students with self-confidence and Black consciousness that teachers at Black House embraced an explicit critique of oppression in the work that they were doing. And they did so because they recognized, quote, the psychological impact of being hit with racism, and felt that some degree of instilling was necessary to overcome the dominant ideologies around white supremacy and provide students with a sense of pride in their Blackness. At the same time, however, Black House also drew from the free school movement and aimed to center progressive pedagogical practices in their work as well. So Black House, many of Black House's offerings were also utilized experiential and hands-on pedagogical methods, and courses at Black House built on students' prior knowledges. For example, Lynn Burbridge, Black House's co-director, describes how they drew from students' experiences of Blackness as a starting place for academic instruction. Quote, our students are allowed to do what a white teacher would never understand or allow, use their cultural idioms in writing, give accounts of what life in the street is like, and draw generally upon their very different experiences as Blacks, unquote. Similarly, in a course on law and order, students drew from their experiences with law enforcement and its effect on the Black community. Black House also valued a holistic student-centered education. Students were able to choose from a variety of classes, which included theater, arts, sewing, photography, Afro-Haitian dance, karate, basketball clinic, and private tutoring. These classes existed in tandem with Black House's core curriculum, which revolved around Black studies and survival techniques such as math, reading, and writing. Students were also given space for their own self-directed learning. As Joy Davis, the student that I interviewed, remembers, our history classes would be of our choice, what we wanted to hear about. English, you could read any book you wanted to. You weren't mandated to read a particular book for that class. You pick what you wanted to read, and she appreciated this approach because she felt that it was a lot more engaging because you're allowing the students to do what they felt like doing without stepping outside of what was required for the school to continue. Similarly, for grades, as Gordon Jackson, director of Black House, describes, examinations were up to the individual instructor. We have examinations that may vary from the normal type of examinations given, like there were a lot of oral examinations. Our assignments, a lot of times, in fact, examinations also, depending on the instructor, I think you'll find there to be lots of different kinds of examination forms. So Black House gave students A's, B's, or C's, or no credit. The school did not give D's or F's because, quote, we felt that those things, regardless of how much students grew after that remains on their record and it's punitive in their grade point average. Regarding attendance, quote, you could come and go as you please, there weren't all these restrictions on you. It wasn't like at Berkeley High where you had so many tardies and absences and then you had your parents call. So, like other experimental schools, Black House really valued students' self-directed learning, and this was reflected in their grading and attendance policies as well as the pedagogical practice that they used. So the school was both structured and aimed to develop students' understanding of Black consciousness and also had a more explicit focus on academic curricula than some of the other experimental schools, and yet also drew from many of the experimental and open classroom philosophies of the time in the way that they were working with Black students. And so that's just a quick summary of the accounts that I found on Black House based on the archival record, but of course, if folks have personal narratives to share, I'd love to hear from you. And we're gonna open up the,
To conclude with a few things. First of all, school districts do not have memories. They either hide the past, deny the past, or are willfully ignorant of the past. Because each time you get a new superintendent, you get a new, I'll be nice. You get someone who wants to impose their will upon this system, which they don't really usually know at all. Sometimes maybe a little bit. I can guarantee that was the case with Dick Foster when he came in as superintendent in Berkeley. And also, one of what I meant by starting with the memory is that let's take a look at what the experimental schools and the periphery, like other ways and Kilimanjaro and all, what did they do that would be useful now? In other words, I think we have to reconceptualize our notion of evaluation. Evaluation doesn't mean, okay, we'll come in and show why they failed, as somebody's thesis did. I won't mention who, but I did for those who need to know. That in effect, what is it that was useful for now that Casa offered? What, in fact, did their conflicts offer to us who are going through the similar conflicts now? See, I think a sensible evaluation and perspective on the experimental schools would be, what can we extract from both the things they didn't do well and the things that they did do well? in order to transform schools that we currently admit are not doing as well as we would like them to. So at this perspective, all you want to do is not rank or judge the schools. You want to pull from that and from things like cash, additional attempts at reform or restructuring or recreating a district. What did they do, or what that is of value? The evaluation should focus on also what did the administration, the funders, the foundations, the government do to make things fail. Because there is some sense in which when you fund a project for 3 years, that hopelessly impossible task of creating a decent school in 2 or 3 years. You can't do it. You can do a tiny thing here and there, but to do something on a larger scale, you need a deep commitment that goes into the blood and guts and veins of the system itself. And I would say that when all of these things were going on, there was a subsystem in the district of educators. There were political people in Washington who, in fact, did not want this to succeed, but they did want it to have a nice, pretty face. They wanted it to look good for themselves and damn the kids. And so the kids who would have failed would still fail, and the kids who would succeed still succeed. However, one of the major plus things is many, many young kids came out in a positive way from the efforts of many people who did want these things to work. And I think that that's the message that should be taken up seriously by people who are in the struggle now.
American is the wilderness in the American mind. Was that the title?
That was the name of the book.
That was the book that I had. At Community High School. So I just think that from the point of view of those of us who were children, students in the class, we could answer a lot of your questions, Herb, as to what made it work and where it didn't work, in ways that an evaluator probably could not really get to easily. And I would say that one of the things that made it work, I believe, were the authentic people who were teaching us, so that we actually had true human beings who we could understand and respond to as equal in our humanness, not obviously equal in our knowledge. But that's not very quantifiable. So I think that when somebody's doing even qualitative evaluation, it's really hard to say, what is that little piece of humanity that instructor brings into the classroom, so that the students would stay in the art room until we were kicked out maybe at 5:30 or 6 in the evening, rather than, doing something else. Or so that we all wanted to go to Jose Romero's house in the Mission and cook dinner together in a way that today's teachers would never even think appropriate. I mean, it would sound like a recipe for abuse or something terrible, but in fact it was a recipe for real acknowledgement of each person as a person that made you want to learn, made you want to take the challenge that our wonderful instructors were offering. Or Elizabethan, who did a women's consciousness raising group as a course. Sisterhood is powerful, and we used a textbook, and But really, we were very young women at the forefront of the feminist movement that was being created at the same time by older women. So I did want to speak to Black House because when Buddy and his students left, I think a lot of us were very, very sad about that because as students we loved him greatly. And yet those of us who were in Liz's class were like, oh, we kind of get it because here we are as young women wanting our own space too. So anyway, that's just a little bit.
If you remember, what were the demographics of the schools like? Were they like representative of the city's diversity, or were they almost a smaller segregation of sorts of students, if that makes sense?
I have it here.
Oh, great.
Okay, go ahead. Community High School began in the spring of 1969. The student body reflected that of Berkeley High School. 50% Caucasian, 40% Black, 10% other. And track 1 at Berkeley High School, 20%. Track 2, 60%. Track 3, 20%. Does that answer your question, sir?
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, I can answer for other ways. I will say that, again, I don't have the figures in front of me, is that our student body would be about 50% Anglo and about 50% African American. And we had a few, we had maybe half dozen Latino and Asian American students, but it was pretty balanced in numbers between African American and white students.
Can I ask a quick follow-up?
Sure.
In getting the students to come to those schools and programs, was it by choice and just by chance that this diversity came, or not?
I couldn't repeat this.
Was it by chance? Oh, sorry, you got it.
No, it was not by chance. We didn't have any. Berkeley, if you understood Berkeley those days, a lot of the kids came because their friends were in it. I would say our major recruitment after the first few students came with the other kids.
Okay.
Okay, and a lot of these kids were effectively, no matter how well they performed or not, were effectively not within the school in a particularly positive way.
I just wanted to say it was not by chance. We specifically were trying to reflect the actual demographics of Berkeley High, and our plan was to have a beginning class and then to add another one, and then so we had all the different years represented as well as all these demographics. I don't remember much about the application and recruiting process, but we couldn't have gotten this close by, lottery or something.
Yeah.
Carl, would you speak about what happened to Community High when Black House started, when Buddy came to you?
Well, there was not a lot of racial animosity and conflict within the school. There was certainly the discontent and all the issues that people have already spoken to that were reflected in the larger society, as well as the need to have a space for a Black community to have a space of its own to express itself and so on and so forth. So we felt not only sad, but we felt that the nature of our original our original aim was kind of blown by that time. It sort of migrated into the image. And Black House's withdrawal wasn't the only factor in this by any means, but the image became that of a white hippie school, even though I don't think it was quite accurate, but image is image and facts are something else sometimes. But
could I just say that I taught, of course, on Black history and Black literature with Buddy Jackson. I don't remember the year. Anyway, we worked together, and as Carl has said, one of the important things about community high school, not only was it on track, but it was also supposed to be heterogeneous. And so we were balancing two completely different ideas. I know that there was a Black Power movement going on nationally. I remember Stokely Carmichael coming to Barbara Scales' house and meeting him there. So there were these two things going on, the philosophy of the school and of the district, which Carol Sibley speaks to, and then the idea of self-determination and autonomy. And so in the history spectrum of community high school, we had courses on feminism, we had courses on Native American history, we had courses on Black history and culture. And Buddy was, as I said, the team taught that, and then that simply led in the direction of feeling that the school was not sufficiently meeting the needs of Black kids, and what made sense to the Black community, the Black parents, families, and kids and teachers, was that they separate. And that was sort of devastating to the commitment to heterogeneity.
Hi, my name is Carl Zahn.
I don't think so.
No? Anyway, I was a teacher in the Berkeley schools. I worked with two experimental schools, actually, Agora and East Campus. And one issue around the Black students were when we had.
Just needs to kiss the mic.
When we were trying to form an experimental school, we were told it had to be racially balanced, but that the Black parents weren't interested in having their kids go to some experimental school. They wanted them to get a real education like they saw so many of the white kids had. And so that was always a kind of an issue and a problem. The other experimental school I worked with was East Campus with Tom Parker as a principal. And there was always a kind of issue around structure for the schools when you're organizing experimental schools. How do you put one together and have it structured? Well, one way to work with East Campus, which was, by the way, the continuation school, which was a school where all the kids went who were kicked out of the regular high school. But he was a very creative, imaginative administrator. And he hired a lot of the misfit teachers to work in the school, to work with misfit kids. And so that worked. And so, I don't know, I think that was another way to have an experimental school work, which was to have a highly creative administrator who could also administer a school. Because a lot of the creative ideas that came in the experimental schools where they didn't know how to organize or be organized. And so they kind of didn't work as well. But with Parker and East Campus, he was organized, but he was also let the teachers have a free rein, and it was very successful. So, thank you.
Could I add to what Carl just said? Tom Parker made the comment that one of the critical differences between community high school and having a school within a school, as community high school was, and East Campus, was that East Campus was physically isolated. Community high school moved into the H building in an awful space which was actually better than the bays of the lobby of the community theater, actually, but it was right on top of Cliff Wong's office. And Cliff Wong was, I think everybody would agree, hostile to the notion of community high school and of altering Berkeley High School. And also the people who he worked with, like Lynn Teller, was one of the people in the administration. A lot of duplicity and not straight talking and not friendly at all. And Tom understood that that was a gift that East Campus had that we didn't have.
I'm Greg Castillo. I'm Greg Castillo, and it's just a quick clarifying question for Cole. You mentioned that Alan Capro was the initial co-awardee of that Carnegie grant. Now, did I understand correctly that that was for both curriculum development and teacher training that you both were involved with, or was that only your part of the grant?
I'm having a problem with my hearing, so maybe somebody could say
Just, would you like me to restate that for you? That you
were asking about Alan Capra.
Right. Did he continue working on any part of the educational program?
Well, I'll tell you what happened with Alan. He was on leave from State University of New York at Stony Brook when he came. And he spent most of his time working with the art department at UC Berkeley and within the art community. And then he was on one of the original, and this is what he did afterwards, is he was on the faculty at Cal Arts. And Cal Arts had just opened up, and they had a full-time position for Alan. So he went to Cal Arts. He did write about other ways of it, and his work, I must say, had a fairly profound influence on my development. I mean, he made me a little crazier than I was. He was not at all afraid to do things right on the margin, and I kind of followed along a little bit. And I think a lot of the theatrical and happening sides of what we eventually did came from the spirit of Alan.
Thank you.
Could I say something about Alan? Yes. I don't know if you all know, Alan Capra wrote a book about happenings. And his idea was that the teacher or the instructor should create a situation which would provoke people to respond to it, and then you were to observe the response to the situation that had been created. The art teacher at Berkeley High School, Bill Dane, very carefully read Alan Capra's book, and with his art class decided to create a happening at Berkeley High School, which was to go and purchase a whole lot of used toilets and bring them to the Berkeley High School campus and have them there in the early morning when the students arrive, and to observe their response to this created situation. One of the first people who arrived was Cliff Wong. And he fired Bill Dane immediately, and then the union reinstated him.
It's also interesting that Alan said that his connection with the kids in Berkeley transformed some of his own work and his own teaching. And so there was a mutual benefit in that particular relationship.
Just one quick question. What happened when the experimental schools money ended?
Can I follow up on that? I was going to ask specifically the students and the Black House students. Where did they go? What happened to them?
I can address the one part.
with the Casa students, I went to Franklin, and Franklin did have experimental programs, and I started the Chicano component there, and brought some of the kids came from Casa, so I had 4th, 5th, and 6th graders there, and then, what about the older kids?
During the summer, the director of Black House and myself put together a proposal for Larry Wells to present to the superintendent about breaking up Casa into segments and putting them into different programs. And so Clementinas described one. Then we had high school teachers, so they went to Berkeley High, and some of the others were offered jobs in the lower level. So basically it was broken up into components by grades and then put into different schools.
I'm also a retired teacher. We moved here specifically from the South to have our children in integrated schools with a good educational program. And my husband at the time was a teacher at Kilimanjaro. Both of our children went to Kilimanjaro. I was active as a parent, but I was also working a full-time job. And I'm here because I'm curious about evaluations that have been done, and some mention has been made of this. But as a former teacher, an English teacher, and I taught in the Oakland schools, and I've taught at the community college level, I'm very, very concerned about literacy. And are there any studies about the either reading programs in the experimental school programs, and what were the results and what are the reading levels of kids that went through the ESP compared to in the regular schools? Because I know the regular schools, it was pretty abominable.
As far as I'm aware, there is no significant archival material about outcomes, let alone fiscally what happened to the to the money and how that was allocated and how it was budgeted.
Shouldn't something be done about that? I mean, right now, what we're facing, I mean, for example, the woman who's the head of the Department of Education, yeah, comes out of charter schools, and I guess an implied question that arises to me is whether willing or not, did programs like the experimental school program somehow lay a groundwork or become implicit in this evolution of charter schools?
So David Kirk in Just Schools makes that argument. I think that whether or not that correlation is so strong is, requires more research, but he does make that argument in his book, Just Schools. There's also, there is a report written by the Institute of Scientific Analysis, which you can find at my library, that looked at the outcomes of the schools, and they basically report that there weren't too many significant differences between Berkeley High School and experimental schools as it relates to academic learning. So those are, from what I've seen in the archives, the answers to those two questions. So we have time for probably 2 more questions. I also want to say that my research on this project is ongoing, and I know that there are a number of folks here today who either were students or teachers or participated in the experimental schools in some way. And so if you are open to sharing your narrative and wanting that to be a piece for continued exploration, please see me afterwards. I'd love to talk to you and find a way to have that narrative be recorded for the record. Yes.
I would just like to say to the woman who's the teacher from Kilimanjaro right there,
Perhaps to connect.
Right, and if folks, also, I know there are, again, a lot of former teachers and students and parents here, and if folks wanted to find a way to connect with each other, in addition to connecting or connecting with me, I'll be happy to find a way to make those connections available as well if folks are willing to leave their contact information.
And I'm sorry to extend this, but the question about what happened to students in Black House never really got answered. And I think that the best answer is that the African American Studies Department at Berkeley High was able to offer, if not a complete answer to all their concerns. At least there were able to, once it took quite a bit of a fight to get that department going, but a lot of the elements of Black House were represented and remain represented today in that department.
There are parents or children here that were in the schools. If we knew what you did or what became of you and what your impressions were of the schools or how they impacted you, that would be a little information on the outcomes.
Test scores were always very low. We were one of the endangered schools because test scores were low. But as the kids came into middle school, learning 2 languages, they were coming up. That's not saying anything about really critical thinking. I don't know how that's developed, but I just wanted to say that it is perhaps an inadequate effort to address some of the cultural differences within the district.
If I could just comment, we all know that the schools are basically the same. I mean, right, they haven't changed. They're factories, essentially. And we do window dressing is what we do. And issues maybe change and they become more sophisticated or we use different vocabulary. But ultimately, the issues basically around children are still the same. And I just want us to be very careful about this window dressing. Call it for what it is. At least be aware of it because, for example, bilingual, got voted out in California. And now it's come back popular because of immersion programs. Well, honestly, immersion programs benefit the white kids who are learning Spanish. It does not benefit the Latino kids. And I know because I was a principal at an immersion school in San Francisco. Well, no, it wasn't immersion. We had an immersion program there. And it was not to the benefit of our kids. So once again, I think we always have to be very critical in looking at really what the schools are doing and what they're providing for. So I think the struggle is as important today as it was 50 years ago.
Thank you all for coming today. As I said,